Hello friends, a very warm welcome to the official page of Read My Course. Today we are going to start off with our first biology chapter, that is Cell, the Unit of Life. So let's get an overview of this chapter. This is a chapter from the NCERT book of class 11, Unit 3. The first chapter of Unit 3 is Cell, the Unit of Life. We are going to start off with this chapter and gradually proceed into the further details. So today what we are going to learn is what is a cell. Then we will come to the basic structures of a cell, protoplasm versus cytoplasm. These two are very important components of a normal cell. Then we will come to a little about the history of how a cell was discovered. Then we will read about a very interesting theory, which is the cell theory. And finally, we will end up with two types of cells, that is the eukaryotic cells and the prokaryotic cells. So let's start. First of all, I will tell you what is a cell. According to definition in NCERT, cell is the fundamental structural and functional unit of all living organisms. Now you can ask me that what does this mean? I'll try to explain. For example, I am reading a book. So in a book, what does this consist of? It consists of pages, right? The pages again consist of sentences. The sentences consist of words and the words consist of letters. So we can say that the words or the letters specifically are the unit of a book. In a similar way, what about life? What does the human body consist of? What is the unit of a human body? The unit of a human body is a cell. It is the smallest structure in our body which is capable of individualized functioning. Okay, so these pictures over here are showing how one particular cell from a single cell can divide and replicate and finally turn into a multicellular organism. Let's look at the picture below. The picture below shows how cells duplicate or replicate. Okay, they form tissues. These tissues form the various organs in our body. These organs then transform into the various organ systems, and these organ systems form the various organisms. For example, the humans. Now, moving on to the next slide. So what is the basic structure of a cell? A cell in 3 dimension looks like a planet, right? When we cut it open, we find that inside the planet, we have various well-organized structures. Whereas in 2 dimension, it looks like a flat surface and a flat structure without any kind of undulations. What I want you all to appreciate in this particular figure is that plant cell and animal cells are different from each other structurally. And how is it so? See, in this plant cell, we have this green structure surrounding the wall of the cell. This is the cell wall. You will appreciate that this particular thing is not present in the animal cell. So what is the specific function of this cell wall which is present in the plants? Cell wall provides rigidity and mechanical support to the plant. And you must remember that it is totally absent in animal cells. Now moving on to the next slide. What are cell organelles? Cell organelles are the various structures which are present inside an individual cell, and they are responsible for sustaining the cell and specifically sustaining the human body through their various functions. We will not go into the details about their functions right now. We will only know about their names. So let's start off with knowing their names. We will start off with the brain of the cell. Just like we have a brain in the human body, in a similar way, a cell also has a brain functioning at its center. That is known as the nucleus of the cell, right? Then moving on from the center towards the periphery, we find another very important structure, which is the mitochondria. This mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. That is, it provides energy for the body functioning, and that is why it is also known as the powerhouse of the cell. Now next we move on to the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is a jelly-like structure which is present throughout the cell, but it is not present within the nucleus. Okay, this is the cytoplasm. Then we have the outer covering, that is the plasma membrane. The plasma membrane is the outermost covering in case of an animal cell. But we have learned that in case of a plant cell, the outermost layer is the cell wall. There are various other structures, for example, the vacuoles. The vacuoles are responsible for collecting the particles which are not needed by the cell. Okay, the ribosomes are mainly responsible for protein synthesis within the cell. Then we have the centrioles, then we have the rough endoplasmic reticulum, we have the Golgi apparatus, etc. Moving on to the next slide. Now, protoplasm versus cytoplasm. What is this protoplasm and what is this cytoplasm? We know that protoplasm is the cytoplasm plus nucleoplasm. What is cytoplasm? Cytoplasm is the jelly-like substance which is present here, that is outside the nucleus. What is nucleoplasm? Nucleoplasm is the jelly-like substance which is present inside the nucleus. Okay, so this nucleoplasm present inside the nucleus plus the cytoplasm present outside the nucleus together constitutes the protoplasm. So this is the difference between protoplasm and cytoplasm. Now we will try to learn a little about the history of how a cell was discovered. Who discovered cell? Cell was discovered by Robert Hooke in the year 1665. He, for the first time, observed cork cell structures under a microscope. These are cork cell structures. What he noted was that these cork cells were hexagonal or rhomboid structures and looked like cells or boxes, right? And therefore, he gave the name cellula. And from this term cellula, finally we arrived at the term cell. That is why these structures came to be known as cells. Now, who first described a live cell? It was Anton von Leeuwenhoek. So remember these two things. Who first described a live cell? That was Anton von Leeuwenhoek. Who first discovered cell? That was Robert Hooke. Next, moving on to the next slide. So now we have known that who had discovered a cell. Now who discovered the nucleus? The nucleus was discovered by a person who is known as Robert Brown. Okay, this person Robert Brown for the first time discovered nucleus within the cells. Here we can appreciate this black colored structures inside these cellular structures are the nucleus of the cell. Okay, now moving on to the history of microscopes. Now without a microscope, no microscopic organism can be seen, right? So a cell is a microscopic structure. So without microscopes, it could not be seen. So a very important part of cell history is microscopes history. So invention of the microscope led to the revealing of all the detailed structures of a cell. Anton von Leeuwenhoek played a very prominent role in the discovery of microscopes, and finally he noted those animalcule-like structures in a pond. But today's microscope is quite different from the simple light microscopes which were discovered at the first stage. Today's microscope is known as electron microscope. What it is known as? It is known as electron microscope. Remember one thing, who discovered the electron microscope? Electron microscope was discovered by Ernest Ruska and Max Knoll. These two people, remember the names, Ernest Ruska and Max Knoll. Ruska and Knoll, these two people discovered the electron microscope when? In 1931. Next, moving on to the cell theory. This is a very interesting theory which was first put forward by Theodore Swan and Matthias Sladen. These were two scientists, Theodore Swan and Matthias Sladen, in 1839. They put forward the cell theory. It consists of three statements. First one is that all living organisms are composed of one or more cells. That is, they may be unicellular or they may be multicellular. The second is, cell is the basic unit of structure and organization in organisms. And the third statement is that cells always arise from pre-existing cells. Now, this Sladen and Swan theory constituted of the first two statements. But the third statement was put forward by another scientist who is known as Rudolf Virchow. This person, Rudolf Virchow, almost 20 years later in 1855, he first explained that cells always arise from pre-existing cells, and this theory came to be known as omnis cellula e cellula. So, who gave the postulate of omnis cellula e cellula? It was Rudolf Virchow. Moving on to the next slide. So by now we already know what are unicellular organisms and what are multicellular organisms. Unicellular organisms consist of one cell and all the functions are carried on within that cell. For example, we have bacteria, we have eugenia. And what are multicellular organisms? For example, plants, for example, humans, for example, animals. These are all multicellular organisms. Moving on to the next slide. What are prokaryotic cells? Bacteria, mycoplasma, these are the main forms of prokaryotic cells. Besides these, we have the blue-green alga, the PPLO. What is this PPLO? This PPLO is pleuropneumonia-like organisms. Remember, PPLO is the smallest known organism, okay? And there are some basic features which differentiate these prokaryotic cells from the eukaryotic cells. What are they? Remember that these cells are relatively smaller cells in size. Second thing is that they lack a nucleus. And the third important characteristic is that they have no membrane-bound organelles. So they are smaller cells. First point. Second is they lack a true nucleus. And the third point is that they have no membrane-bound organelles. Here we are showing a structure of a prokaryotic cell where we can appreciate the fact that the DNA structure lies open within the cytoplasm. There is no nucleus in it. Okay? Now moving to the next slide, we have the eukaryotic cells. So eukaryotic cells also have some features which differentiate them from the prokaryotes. What are they? They have a distinct nucleus, which is bound by a distinct nuclear membrane, right? Then we have membrane-bound organelles. These are the membrane-bound organelles which are present within these eukaryotic cells, but they were absent in the prokaryotic cells. Okay. Another important thing is that they possess a very organized genetic material which store the genetic material, that is chromosomes. So this is the main difference between eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. In this picture over here, you can differentiate the size differences between a eukaryotic cell and a prokaryotic cell. See, the prokaryotic cells over here are very small in size in comparison to this eukaryotic cell. Okay. Moving on to the next slide. Here, this is a comparative picture which shows on one side eukaryotic cell and on other side a prokaryotic cell. Most important thing, the first thing that comes to our notice is that in prokaryotic cells, the DNA material is lying open. The DNA material is lying open. In eukaryotic cells, it is lying within the nucleus. Second important thing is that in the prokaryotic cells, no organelles are present. Membrane-bound organelles are not present. But in the eukaryotic cells, membrane-bound organelles are present. So these are the main differences as we have already studied. So by the end of today's session, we have learned about the basics of cell structure. We have learned about the history of cell discovery. We have learned about cell theory. We have learned about unicellular, multicellular organisms. We have learned about prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Okay. So before ending this class, just know a fact that the smallest cell is Mycoplasma. I have already said PPLO. What is it? Pleuropneumonia-like organisms. What is the size? 10 micrometer in size. So you will ask me, what is the largest cell? The largest cell is an ostrich egg. Remember this, the egg cell of an ostrich. The egg of an ostrich is a single cell, and that is the largest known cell. Okay, so with that we come to the end of this class. Next class we will continue with this chapter, cells. Thank you for watching.